to welcome all of you to this important seminar. And all our guests who are here. This year marks the 20th anniversary of South Africa and China relations. We have already had a number of events marking this, include a seminar in March in which Ambassador Lin spoke alongside former Deputy Minister Bahad, one of the official, perhaps most active in the formation of the diplomatic relations between South Africa and China. But our focus is on much broader scale. Our focus is also on the outcomes and characteristics of China's presence in all of Africa. That is why our seminar today is focused on FOCAC, which took place in early September. It came and went, accompanied by many agreements and outcomes, but many questions remain and many more are worth raising. These questions are raised in the context of a changing world, in which China and United States are engaged in a trade war and what may be termed an economic cold war. With this, there rises the possibility of competition over Africa, with each side accusing the other of worse things and bad intentions. Ours is to extract and articulate facts from an African position. However, that is the motivation behind this seminar. We want to discuss openly and in an evidence-based manner some of the occurrences and statements from an African perspective. We had extended invitation to the Chinese embassy, along with other African embassies, high commissions, and this for this seminar. And all our seminars will be freely available online. In fact, it is being streamlined as we go. It will be viewed by everyone who are interested. Today's seminar will be in 2 sessions, during both of which there will be a chance to question and raise comments. The first session will focus on bilateral relations of various countries on the continent. The keynote speech will focus on Ethiopia. The second will focus on Kenya, and the third will focus on South Africa. As I was saying to my Ethiopian brother, that I remember when I was young, in my early teenage, I won't tell you how old I am. Ethiopia has always been on my mind. It was terrible years, early 80s, with those who are old enough to remember famine in Ethiopia. My early understanding of continent and politics started then. But I'm fascinated that at this level, we go to Ethiopia, it is no longer the Ethiopia of the 1980s. It has completely changed. And Ethiopia today demonstrates to all of us as Africans that our continent will change. And it is happening in Ethiopia. A country without minerals, without all the other riches that some of us are privileged having. Desert, the greatest asset in Ethiopia is nothing else other than Ethiopians, the people. But it's able to grow at a rate which is unprecedented on the continent. And my brother would help us, particularly with the focus on how China-Ethiopia relation has been going on. This, among other many continents, our selection of this was based on the interest of political and geographically spread, the Horn of Africa, which Kenya, where's my brother Westen, part of that region, as well as Southern Africa, with South Africa and Zambia. My brother Phiri from Zambia led it yesterday as well. Zambia at the moment is, the attention of the world is on Zambia. I don't know whether for good or bad reasons, but we have a Zambian scholar involved, has been part of government, has been a scholar in his own right, is in the business center. I think he will help us to give us facts on the ground. All the news that we're hearing about Zambia in its relation with China, what's the position of Zambians and what is the real story other than all propaganda that is out there. This seminar has been the product of collaboration between the library as well as the Oxfam Pan-Africa, which has shaped the second session, which will especially focus on debt, as I mentioned, Zambia in particular, an interesting topic which will merit a lot of study. We look forward to the question and answer session. I'm now going to hand over to my co-director, Professor Peng, to chair the very first session. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could put your phones on silent, and as we always say, the spirit of University of Johannesburg, this is an academic institute, and questions, views, statements are raised in a civil way, and we let us engage and enjoy what we are doing. Professor Peng, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Honorable Dr. Oscar, the Director of Internationalization Division from UJ, distinguished guests, student, staff, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar on the future of Africa-China relations. Conclusion from FOCAC 2018. Thank you for joining for this discussion on this important topic. This year's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which took place on the 3rd and 4th of September, the biggest by far, it saw 40 heads of state and government from the African continent join the Chinese President Xi Jinping and his delegation, as well as participation from the United Nations and other international non-governmental organizations. The discussions also saw meetings between the business and entrepreneurs of both China and Africa, with both sides coming to the agreement that not only should Chinese companies and entrepreneurs make use of opportunities on the African continent, but also that African business should gain access to the Chinese market, which at 1.5 billion people is the biggest in the world. From the summit, a lot has been written, with different perspectives emerging, with many different and interesting conclusions. We are fortunate to have excellent scholars join us to lead the discussions on those complex issues. While amongst from the FOCAC, their insight and experience of the past and present nature of the relations between Africa countries and China will be a useful guide for anticipating the future. The seminar will be divided into 2 sessions. The first will run from 11:15 until 1:15, with 3 presentations and a question and answer session. I would like to ask the speakers of the first session to make their way to the stage first. Welcome. Okay. The first speaker, Professor Messay. Let us welcome the first speaker of the evening. He has graciously traveled all the way from Ababa to give this discussion, and we are grateful to him for his commitment. He has had a first-hand experience of China, as he was a visiting research fellow at Fudan Development Institute of Fudan University. Dr. Messay is the director of the Center of Food Security Studies of Addis, Ababa University. He is also the associate professor of Associate Economic Development Planning and Environmental Studies at the College of Development Studies, Addis Ababa University, a country that is also the site of the headquarters of the African Union. His discussion will therefore not only talk about the relationship between Ethiopia and China, but also the role of the AU in the African-China relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Tefera.
So, first of all, I would like to express my happiness to be here in South Africa, very beautiful country, and in fact, these days, a country with the first economic status in Africa, country of His Excellency Mr. Mandela, the icon of freedom. So I'm very happy to be here. And again, I would like to thank the officials of the University of Johannesburg Confucius Institute for the invitation. I thank you very much, and I will go to the presentation with this. So, as you can see on the slide, my title is on Sino-Ethiopian Economic Development Relations, or Actors, Determinants, and the Trends. My presentation, my speech, has this outline, objectives, research methods, background information about Ethiopia, Ethiopia-China relationships, and finally, the concluding remarks. So, what happened? Yeah, the objective, or the prime objective of this seminar is to show empirically the economic development ties between China and Ethiopia, in particular, in fact, empirical studies both in Ethiopia and Africa. So the research methodology, in fact, I used looks like this one. I tried to investigate or contact government offices like Ethiopia Investment Commission, Ethiopia Railway Corporation, and in fact, many field visitors, both in Ethiopia and in China. I visited about 5-6 investment projects in China, and in fact in Ethiopia also, and key informant interviews. So the data analysis I employed is both qualitative and quantitative, as you can see here. Now, let me give you a very short, brief introduction of Ethiopia. As you know, we are located in the Horn of Africa with a population of about 105 million people, with about 105 million people, and as you can see here, it is one of the fast growing country in economic aspect these days in the world. So I don't know how many of you know this fact. Ethiopia is also considered to be the cradle of mankind, source of humanity. You may know Lucy, the mother of humanity on earth. We consider it in that way. And I'm really very much happy to talk of Lucy wherever I am in the world, because we are the mother of the world. We consider it in that way. In fact, it is. And again, we are also home of ancient civilizations like construction of obelisks, weaving, and others. We are said to be source of coffee, and also it is rich in different natural and man-made resources, as you can see over there. And interestingly, Ethiopia has its own letters, which we are using next to English. And also, you know, African Union is located in Africa, and Ethiopia played the greatest role for the establishment of African Union, starting from Emperor Haile Selassie, who had contributed greatly for the establishment of these organizations. In fact, this one is the AU headquarters located in Addis Ababa, constructed under direct support of the Chinese government, for which we are always thankful for the Chinese government and the people. And also, it is a land of Christianity and Islam, as you can see here. Colorful celebrations we have, as you can observe on the slides here. And these are some of the natural resources that we have. Many cultural and historical heritage. About 11 has been already listed in the UNESCO World Heritage List, and 5 are in the waiting list. And we are member of UN, AU, IGAD, COMESA, and the like. And with this introduction, it is a brief. Why? Because I hope all of you know Ethiopia very well. So the question is now, is Ethiopia rising really? We always say Africa is rising, Ethiopia is rising, and the like here and there. What are the indicators? Let me just show you at a glance why we say that Ethiopia is rising. And some of them, if, for example, you look at the great Renaissance Dam now, we are building on Blue Nile, nearby Sudan. It is going to produce about 7,000 megawatt electric power. It is going to be one of the largest hydroelectric power in the continent. One of the indicators it means. And again, as you can see here, and most of them are in fact constructed by using the help of the Chinese government in one way or another. We have beautiful express roads now in Ethiopia. The roads, as you can see here, connecting towns, particularly Adama and Addis Ababa, the capital, and also Hawassa city in Ethiopia. And also, we say that Addis Ababa, construction is booming now in Addis Ababa. For those of you who visited the city, you can observe constructions of this type here and there in the continent. In fact, with the support I said earlier, we recently introduced urban suburbs like this one, very modern of its kind, even in the continent, I think, in Addis Ababa. And in fact, we are building roads, railways, connecting small towns and cities in the continent, as you can see. And railways connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti port, most important port that we have. We are importing and exporting about 98% of items through port Djibouti, as you know. In fact, I need to also acknowledge here it has been the truth with the support of the Chinese government and the people. And we have industrial parks, as you can see here, about 8 government-owned industrial parks across the country. Northern, eastern, center, and southern part of this one. This one is one of the industrial parks we have. It is in Hawassa, about 300 kilometers away from the center. Constructed still by the support of the Chinese government. And this one is Makale Industrial Park. And this one is Adama Industrial Park. It was just inaugurated on 7 October 2018. In the middle, you observe our PM, an excellent leadership we have ever in Ethiopia, the transformative leadership. And we inaugurated it very recently, and as you can see here, it has been constructed by the Chinese organization, China Civil Engineering and Construction Company, CCECC, under the cost of about 140 million US dollars. And it is going to be a home for about 60,000 employees in the near future. 60,000, I said. No. So, in fact, our airlines are also one of the most important economic sector that I would like to mention. It is connecting Africa, connecting the world to Africa too. We have about 100 aircraft, as you know. And or some indicators like the growth in GDP, which is about 11, agricultural and allied sectors are now growing by 6%, and many others, as you can see the list here. So all these are said to be indicators for the fact that we really say Ethiopia is rising this day. So when we go to Ethiopia-China relationship, specifically, what are we doing? The theme of this presentation. In fact, the relationship between Sino or China and Africa is or very long. As you can see, it is assumed to be started about 10th century BC, before the Europeans arrived Africa, I guess, before Vasco da Gama and others, around the 10th century BC, particularly in Egypt. So it is not recent that the Chinese came to the continent. Related to the modern era of the relationship, Afro-Asian, it was, I think, in 1955, when there was the conference in Bandung in Indonesia, when 29 African states participated. As you can see, Ethiopia is one of them over there, and the money we have 29 in 1915. It is assumed to be the starting point of the modern relationship between Africa and Asia. And in fact, during this dynasty, or 1368 up to 1644 in China, contacted people who used to live in the present-day Horn of Africa, particularly Djibouti, Somalia, and the like, the Horn of Africa. And related to Ethiopia, the first cultural delegation was sent in 1956. Then this cultural delegation opened ways for Africa, for Ethiopia to contact Ethiopia in 1956, particularly during these two giant guys, Mao Zedong and Ethiopian Haile Selassie. It was in 1971 that we established a diplomatic relationship with China, it means. And then followed the diplomatic relationship. Interestingly enough, we have now about 60 bilateral agreements, 60 bilateral agreements now, among which these are listed here over. We have about 60 bilateral relationships that we need to be in mind. And when we look at the economic ties, export-import, as you can see here, we are currently importing huge amount of commodities from China. In fact, we are also importing to China these days. As you can read over there, the FOB value was about 664 million US dollars, while the export value was about 72 million US dollars. In fact, here you can observe there is a trade imbalance between the two states, it means. So, anyway, as you can observe, there is a great export-import relationship between these two countries. Interestingly enough, it started increasing about 2006, and escalating, as you can see the graph over here, it means. So this indicated the relationship between two countries, China and Ethiopia, is really increasing over time. And also, China started massive investment in Ethiopia, as you can see over here, in 1998. Currently, China is a leading number of projects. The number is in September 2017, a year ago, or about 10 months ago, it was about 1,171 projects we had in Ethiopia. Chinese investment projects, it means. This indicates really how much China is contributing to the economic development in China. There is no, in Ethiopia, I mean, there is no country, whether it is in Europe or the Americans, there is no such a country contributing massively to the development of Ethiopia nowadays. So if you see, again, the FDI also, it is very huge, as you can observe over here. And it is also increasing starting from this year, 1998. Look at the graph, how it is really massively increasing over years. The investment, of the Chinese investment in Ethiopia, it means. And again, particularly the manufacturing, the first graph, how much it is very big in that specifically. And this is why I said already, construction is very much booming in the country, whether it is in Addis Ababa or other small towns in the country, it means. And in fact, we have the total here that I mentioned earlier. I divided into 4 in this way. And what about the capital inflow? As you can look at it, registered China origin operational investment project between August and September 2017 in Ethiopia amounted to 18.26 billion Ethiopian birr. Very huge, equivalent to 671 million USD as the current exchange rate, in fact. Very huge amount, as you can observe here. And also, or similarly, Chinese joint investment with Ethiopian and others adds up to 5.62 billion ETB, or equivalent to 206 million US dollar. Very massive still, as you can observe here. And also, you can see the capital inflow, the graph. It was only around 2013 that it reduced, owing to the kind of policy change in Ethiopia at that specific year, it means. But still, it is booming, as you can see the graph, it means. And also, this one is the figure, which is 877.31 billion, as you can observe here. Very huge amount, capital inflow. I divided into 2, pre-implementation, implementation, and operational, in fact. And what about the jobs? Interestingly enough, about 500,000, 500,000 jobs has been created by the Chinese investment in Ethiopia. About 500, 500,000 it means. Very huge, very massive, as you can observe here. So I tried to divide the job also in this way, and mostly you find it in manufacturing sector, as you can see here, this is it means. China's investment in Ethiopian technology transfer. And this study investigated and observed that there is transfer of skill from China to Ethiopia. Not unlike what other writers put it. There is real technology transfer from China to Ethiopia in the areas of construction, operation, and management of railways, in the construction of multi-story buildings. In Addis Ababa these days, you observe multi-story buildings. And also in manufacturing industries, in the construction of industrial parks, I've shown you earlier, ICT, e-marketing, e-learning, e-banking, energy development, shipping, and the like have been transferring from China to Ethiopia, undoubtedly. We observed it in this study, it means. And there is also technology or skill transfer, in fact, that China may learn from Ethiopia. We found that, for example, production and the management of coffee can be learned by the Chinese, Organic honey production and processing can be learned by the Chinese. And finally, indigenous crops like teff. We have the crop which is indigenous to Ethiopia. We call it teff, not teff, but teff. So the Chinese may be able to learn from Ethiopia also in this way. Just to show you the kind of mutual benefit. In fact, I don't know whether we can say it mutual, but Chinese are extremely massively contributing to the development of Ethiopia these days. Concluding remark. So in the development context of post-2015, particularly, development agenda, international economic activities are said to be very important, particularly post-2015, post-Millennium Development Goals, it means. Therefore, this is just to recommend that the relationship between Africa and China, Africa and Ethiopia is really vital for both nations or for both areas. In view of this reality, the economic cooperation between Ethiopia and China is found to be fundamental for both countries, particularly I think for Africa. Why? Because we are developing, we are transforming, it means. So it creates more investment mainly for Chinese, and again, job, technology, and the like for Africa as a whole and Ethiopia in particular, it means. So with this, I have a recommendation, like, therefore, in order to make the most out of the economic ties, the following points should be taken into account. One is what you call mutual benefit between Africa and China, mutual benefit. I'm sorry to say, unlike the relationship between the Western world and Africa, unlike I said, in this case, we need to have mutual benefit, to benefit Ethiopia, benefit Africa, benefit China too. I need to say this one boldly everywhere I am. Maximum benefit to the local people, particularly related to displacement. Adequate compensation should be there for the farmers who might be displaced because of the investments in Ethiopia. Joint fight against corruption. Ethiopia in particular and Africa in general are under severe corruption these days, as you know. Particularly in Ethiopia, we have at a grand level of corruption. Therefore, Chinese government should be able to help us fight against this disease, this cancer of development, I can say. And then there should be also mutual promotion between Africa and China. One should not degrade the other, it means, on the other hand. We should be able to do that, and technical support, in fact. And again, quality of products. Why I try to recommend this one, when I go to Europe, when I buy commodities, it says China, made in China, but with high quality, durable. When I try to buy commodities in Africa, in Ethiopia, it is with low quality. So I recommend Chinese investors, the government, to consider, China to export good commodity to Africa too. Some of us have the purchasing power. And improve service delivery. This one is on the side of Africans. We should be able to reduce the bureaucracy and the like, so that we will be able to attract more investors from China and in fact elsewhere. The other one is continued refrainment from intervention of internal issues. In fact, yes, I know that China is not intervening in the international political issues, and this must be kept constant. We don't want anybody to interfere to our political arena. We can do our own politics based on homemade models. We don't need to copy-paste regarding political issues, it means. So I recommend this one strongly. And I would like to thank and appreciate FDD for granting me visiting research scholarship in Shanghai to carry out this research. And I also would like to thank the University of Johannesburg Confucius Institute for the invitation for this very vital seminar. And thank you very much all.
Thanks for Prof. Tafara's presentation. The second speaker is Dr. Westen Shilaho. Dr. Westen Shilaho is a National Research Foundation Scarce Skills Research Fellow, based as South African Research Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy in University of Johannesburg. He was a Mellon Scholar from 2009 to 2011 under the Andrew Mellon Mentoring Scholarship. Dr. Shilaho has lectured in the International Relationships and Politics Department at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He also served as a researcher at the Center of the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Johannesburg. Dr. Shilaho's research interests include Africa and international criminal justice, electoral politics, democratic transitions, and Kenya politics. He holds a doctorate in politics from the University of Witwatersrand and is a member of Golden Key International Honor Society. Dr. Shilaho's latest publications are Political Power and Tribalism in Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Westen Shilaho.
Thank you so much.
Or any this one?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, there's so much one can say about this topic, particularly when it comes to Sino-Kenyan relations, and given how topical this particular issue is currently. And I think you are lucky that I'll do a synopsis of what already obtains in one of the policy briefs you were given. So if you want to delve deeper, there's that handout that you received once you came in. So this presentation is anchored in Kenya's international relations since independence in 1963 to date, Kenya's foreign policy, Kenya's quest for democratization, and its ambition to become a middle-income country by 2030, and within the larger aegis of African Union Agenda 2063. And the salient argument I make in this particular presentation is that despite the Look East policy that Kenya's politicians have punted, beginning with Mwai Kibaki and currently Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenya is still very much an ally of the West and still very much dependent to the West and still very much one of the anchor states in Africa that the West considers to be strategic as far as international capital is concerned. So I think that has to be thrashed out up front. Therefore, Kenya's foreign policy hasn't been captured in writing, curiously enough, from 63 to 2014. That's when something came out in terms of a publication. And when you look at this publication, Kenya's foreign policy rests on 5 planks: economic diplomacy, peace diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy. And what is the leitmotif in all these planks? Security, peace, territorial integrity, participation in multilateral bodies, and attraction of foreign investment are central to Kenya's international relations. And that's how the Chinese influence and role in Kenya's infrastructural development falls in. So since Kenya gained independence in 1963, Western capital, and particularly British and American, has strongly influenced Kenya's domestic and international politics. And as one of the country's authors noted way back in 1963, and I quote, Kenya's overwhelming dependence on Western capital is partly a result of her historical past and partly a function of the local ruling class. She inherited an economic infrastructure developed along capitalist lines, and those leaders who took power at independence worked for the consolidation of that system. In an effort to attract more foreign capital into the country, the new leaders passed a law guaranteeing protection to foreign investment, end of quote. And therefore, if you look into literature around this area, you realize that Kenya has always been, even under the non-aligned movement, under Pan-Africanist movement, under the Organization of African Unity, vis-a-vis the fight against the vestiges of colonialism and white minority rule in Southern Africa, Kenya has always exhibited equivocation. They've always been ambivalent in the sense that they would always look where is the popular opinion shifting to, and then they would take the position. And that partly explains why, for instance, the ANC had camps in Tanzania and Uganda, but hardly had any in Kenya. And so this brings us to the other very salient issue vis-a-vis Kenya's international relations, the war on terrorism. The war on terrorism, and particularly in Kenya's neighborhood of Somalia, and particularly the terror attacks in Kenya in 1998, headstrong put Kenya at the center of this war, and that has ensured that Kenya, and particularly the United States of America, have always had to work together, synergize efforts as far as tackling this malaise is concerned. But the politics of the country vis-a-vis democratization has to some extent enabled the leadership of the country, particularly beginning with Mwai Kibaki and then Uhuru Kenyatta, to sign a raft of bilateral agreements with the Chinese under the Look East rubric. And that made certain analysts to infer that the country has shifted from the west to the east, which is not the case. My argument that Kenya's engagement with the Chinese is not an ideological shift, rather it's idiosyncratic in terms of Mwai Kibaki's politics locally. Remember the 2007 violently contested elections. Remember 2013 contested elections, and remember Kenya's cases at the International Criminal Court and how some of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, particularly the US, Britain, and France, argued that Kenya's cases must be resolved at the ICC. And that gave Kibaki and Uhuru Kenyatta, his successor, some kind of reason to lean or appear to lean towards the Chinese. But when Uhuru Kenyatta eventually had charges withdrawn, his rhetoric against the West fizzled out. And those who remember, before he went to China the other day under the FOCAC summit, he had been to the White House to see Donald Trump. So this paper in a way tries to thrash out the substance of Kenya's relationship with the Chinese and the West, and what obtains in popular media, and what commentators, especially those who are sympathetic to the regime in Nairobi, have always said. And so, apart from the proxy war that Kenya has been engaged in, the Chinese have had a footprint in Kenya's infrastructure development under the standard gauge railway, which is Uhuru Kenyatta's flagship development project, in as much as it was conceived and launched under Mwai Kibaki, his predecessor, under the highly controversial coalition government in which he shared power with Raila Odinga. So this GR is a standard gauge railway that was funded by the Chinese, but which was supposed to extend from Kenya's port city of Mombasa to the hinterland and beyond to Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, and eastern DRC. But it has run into choppy waters, and this has cast aspersions regarding its viability, because the feasibility study initially carried out before this project was launched showed that this project was unviable, and its economic significance to the country was found to be not. But it was launched nonetheless. The cynics have been vindicated in the sense that, for instance, Rwanda has pulled out of this GR, citing high costs and citing the fact that the land through which this project was supposed to go through, the cost had suddenly exponentially shot up, which meant that the budget they had set aside for this kind of project went through the roof. So they opted to use the Tanzanian route through the port city of Tanga. Uganda also pulled out, and this project was supposed to go into the neighboring Uganda, at the same time citing high costs. But what is happening here? What's happening here is large-scale corruption in Kenya that has massively raised the cost of constructing the Kenyan section of SGR, which influenced the decision by Rwanda. Rwanda is considered to be the least corrupt country if we go by the Transparency International reports that come out time and time again. It's also claimed that foreign capital in terms of French Total influenced Tanzanian route to be the option because French Total is also drilling oil in Tanzania. And the Chinese came in and insisted that they were ready to fund the Rwandan section on condition that the Ugandan section on condition that Uganda used the Chinese contractor. So in the event of the prohibitive cost of the Kenyan section, coupled with the influence of French giant Total, this put a damper to what was built to be a transport corridor in the region. And what we remain with is a railway infrastructure that is only confined to Kenya and has cobbled astronomical amount of money. And analysts are wondering whether that money will be recouped. They're wondering whether in the event that that money couldn't be recouped because the project cannot sustain itself, how the loan that the Kenyan government borrowed from the Chinese will be repaid. But this also talks to duplication of efforts. Whereas Kenya launched the SGR project, there's also another project called the LAPSET, Lamu port project that was supposed to extend to the hinterland to South Sudan and Ethiopia. That project was also launched parallel to the SGR, but then nothing has been heard about the LAPSET project since the SGR project. So critics have faulted the SGR project, arguing that Kenya would have done better to concentrate on the LAPSET project and revamp the archaic colonial railway line, because the argument that the new SGR will be self-sustaining, in the sense that it will shift the transport of freight from the coastal city of Mombasa to the hinterland, cannot stand scrutiny, because Kenyan politicians have heavily invested in road transport, and therefore it will be hard for them to let go of that lucrative business and let the rail line exclusively transport freight from the port city to the hinterland. But how do we make sense of this politics of infrastructural development between Kenya and China? I use the lens of crony capitalism and the politics of extroversion in Kenya to try and make sense of why Uhuru Kenyatta's government would go ahead despite feasibility studies showing that this project is not viable. So this is where there's the interface between private interest and public interest, in the sense that the Kenyan politicians, beginning with Uhuru Kenyatta and the other state functionaries, have got large business interests in almost the entire gamut of the economy, ranging from infrastructure to farming, to housing, to health, to insurance, to transportation and everything. And so in this kind of capitalism, politicians are not interested in what is in the best interest of the citizenry. They're interested in profit. And mega infrastructural projects have got large spin-offs in terms of rents. And so when you talk about the asymmetrical relationship between Kenya and the West, or Kenya and China, it's asymmetrical and detrimental to the interests of the citizenry, but it's profitable to the political elite and their cronies, especially who are engaged in business, because they can extract a lot of rents in terms of whether it is overpricing the project 100 times. So then your companies will bid for these projects, and the benefits accrue to you as an individual, even as the country is hobbled down by the debt trap. And so the major infrastructure projects such as roads, rail lines, they're portrayed as meant to increase the efficiency of the economy. But curiously enough, this is not accompanied by the improvement in the manufacturing sector. For instance, critics of the SGR argue, how can the railway be only for the movement of passengers? That's not sustainable. What other goods will be transported along this railway line? Now, if the railway line is supposed to be an economic lifeline of the country, why does the government insist also on transporting the crude oil from Turkana to the port city of Mombasa by road? It doesn't make sense. So there seems to be schizophrenia in terms of launching projects and at the same time insisting on the old way of doing things in terms of road transportation, while at the same time lots of money has been pumped into this standard gauge railway network. But that is not irrational. It's rational in the sense that the politicians would rather invest or appear to be investing in these projects, mega infrastructure projects, because they have got a personal interest and they profit them at a personal level. And as Kenyans debate about the viability of such projects, the lifeline of the economy in terms of coffee, sugarcane farming, tea, have almost collapsed. And this is where the bulk of the citizenry gain their sustenance. But it's not the best interest of the government. It's not, because there are no profits here. The profits that are there are in mega projects. And this sector is left to the middlemen, who derive a lot of benefits at the expense of the farmers. And then the second thing is the bulk of the Kenyan economy is in the informal sector, Juakali, that's what it's called. The government hasn't been as keen in improving that economy as it has been in borrowing and indebting the country to the Chinese and other lenders. So I think that theoretical lens helps us to appreciate, even as those who are critical of this lopsided relationship between the Kenyan government and the Chinese and across Africa, that the politicians appreciate what they are doing, in the sense that their interest is not for the economic benefit of the citizenry. The interest is personal profits that come out of these major infrastructure project outlays. But this kind of politics eventually implodes, as it happened in Ivory Coast and Liberia, when the politicians hoard all the economic benefits at the expense of the citizenry. That's not sustainable. It happened in Liberia, it happened in Ivory Coast. And so we have to hold these people to account and ensure that even as they sign multilateral and bilateral agreements, they're guided by nothing other than the interests of the citizenry. And some of the countries that we borrow from, such as the Asian tigers, the curious thing is that the leadership in those countries was never involved in business. So when you have a politician who at the same time a businessman, the irresistible temptation is to ask every other deal they engage in, what is there for me, as opposed to what is there in the best interest of the citizenry. And that's what we have in Kenya, especially under Uhuru Kenyatta, whose family holdings has exponentially expanded since he came to power in 2013. And so, what is the way forward vis-a-vis Kenya-China relationship? Kenya has not taken advantage of this relationship. And my take is not to blame the Chinese. It's about international relations, whereby it's about maximizing your national interests. And if whoever you're dealing with is not keen on their national interests, or they don't appreciate what their national interest, then you can't blame the one who is adroit and astute. So Kenya, for instance, hasn't taken advantage of the Chinese market. And therefore, there is this trade deficit between Kenya and China, almost to the extent that virtually Kenya imports everything from China and exports virtually nothing to the Chinese. And critics have argued, how can that be the case? How can that be the case? Why doesn't the political elite look into that and try and maximize on this kind of relationship? So in 2015, for instance, Kenya's imports from China totaled 320.8 billion Kenya shillings, and exports to China a paltry 8.4 billion. Imports from China increased during the construction of the Chinese-funded and managed SGR, with the first phase from Mombasa to Nairobi having been concluded. I'm told the time is up. So is the SGR a vanity project? Well, these kind of projects remind us of somebody like Felix Ofe-Boigny of Ivory Coast, who was affectionately referred to as Papa, who at some point went to Rome and saw the St. Peter's Basilica. And when he went back to Ivory Coast, he decided to replicate that architectural masterpiece, not in Abidjan, but in his home area of Yamoussoukro. And that ended up being a white elephant, despite having guzzled lots of money. So is the SGR in the Kenyan context a vanity project? That's the question we're asking. From the look of things, it appears to be. Because despite its completion, the first phase from Mombasa to Nairobi, and the Chinese having expressed disquiet and having been reluctant to fund it further, because when Uhuru Kenyatta met the Chinese leadership during the last FOCAC meeting, he was told that the Chinese could not fund the leg from Nairobi to Naivasha and subsequently to the western part of the country because they did not see the viability of that project. So in a way, it has run into headwinds. So which way out? Kenya is already in debt to the tune of 5.1 trillion as we speak currently. And this year has cost about $6 billion US, which is equal to 1/3 of Kenya's foreign debt. And this is before the extension to Western Kenya, if at all, funding will be available. So the criticism has been that the Uhuru Kenyatta government has poured the taxpayer money into a dark hole. And it's going to indebt Kenyans into the foreseeable future. Both those who are currently alive in Kenya and those who are yet to be born. But it doesn't come as news. It comes as news perhaps to those who are zealot, who are enthusiastic about it, those who invoked nationalism when the project was launched, and those who couldn't ask the hard questions. But all these are documented about this. For instance, there's this very high-profile critique of this project, and especially the lopsided Kenya-China relationship. It's called David Mui, who has argued that unless you do away with the corruption that hollowed out Kenyan state institutions, including the Kenya Railway, and rendered the lunatic line, the one that the British constructed, dysfunctional and profitable, this SGR is likely to fall prey to the same malaise of corruption, influence peddlers, and well-connected individuals who have got interest in the road transportation. He contends that the carrying capacity of the SGR, or if you reduce the cost, does not in substance make this new rail line any markedly different from the lunatic line, because we are told the speed has increased on SGR from 60 kilometers per hour to 80 kilometers per hour compared to the old railway line. But he argues that cargo does not have to move very fast. So when you compare the new railway line that has really consumed a lot of money to the old one, the taxpayer gets nil. There's absolutely zero. So SGR is a bad investment to its critics because it cannot generate the revenue needed to offset the $4 billion spent on building the line from Mombasa to Nairobi. And Kenya should have concentrated on the lap set. I'm told I've got 5 minutes to go. So I will say something about the Sino-Kenyan relationship was in the broader context of Sino-Africa relationship. The China-Africa relationship is always portrayed in the win-win kind of mold. It's based on mutual respect, as opposed to the one between Africa and the West. And this relationship is defined outside the boundaries of paternalism that the West has always been accused of: paternalistic, imperialistic, exploitative. But is this really the case when you look at the China-Kenya relationship, China-Africa relationship? This paper argues that that's not so clear-cut. Because in Nairobi, this SGR has also been bedeviled by accusations of racism from the Chinese company running that project, accusations of poor terms of service for the local laborers, discrimination, and the fact that although the projects were conceived to be run by the Chinese and then eventually be transferred to the local Kenyans, that is not likely to be the case because the locomotives are programmed in Mandarin or Chinese and the locals can't run them, so they are reduced to passengers. So then the question is, when would they learn how to run this project or to navigate these locomotives and eventually take over this project after the Chinese have left? That's not likely to be the case anytime soon. There's also those who remember a skit that was curiously shot during the construction of SGR that elicited a lot of furor, that portrayed Africa in a bad light and elicited a lot of accusations of racism. That was in China. And the Chinese government was quick to apologize. That monkey lampoon of black people. So what are we saying here? What we're saying here is that Kenya, and particularly Africa, cannot outsource responsibility and expect that, be it the West or be it China or be it the East, acts altruistically, or it has got its best interest at heart. It's incumbent upon Kenya and Africa to take charge of its destiny and relate with the West, relate with the Chinese, relate with the East, while at the same time not losing sight of its strategic interests. Accusations of racism, be it spying under the AU, be it the monkey lampoon, be it exploitation in Kenya, all these things could be seen under the mood of a nation, first in the sense of Kenya, that has not succeeded in trying to forge a sense of nationhood. A nation that has not, in a way, managed to set up a regulatory framework within which international business has to operate. So when the Chinese come and there is no rule of law, there are no laws that guide them, then they can run the SGR in perpetuity. You're not going to hold them to account. If there are no labor laws, they will exploit the local laborers. There's nothing you can do about that because there are no laws to regulate their operations. And so, in conclusion, I would say China has, to a large extent, contributed to revamping Kenya's infrastructure, especially road network and this SGR flagship project. And that is laudable, owing largely to lack of manpower internally. They say that Kenyan companies lack the wherewithal and the requisite skills to mount such large-scale projects and deliver them in time, as the Chinese have done. So there's something to learn. And this Chinese record is stellar and has to be laudable. But at the same time, Kenya has to borrow a leaf in the sense that eventually there has to be skills transfer from the Chinese to the Kenyan counterparts, who will eventually take charge of this project so that there's no capital flight that we have all along lamented about while talking about the our traditional trading partners in the West and in the US. And Kenya should assert its sovereignty to ensure that there's a common approach, not only amongst Kenyan citizens, but within the greater, large African continent, so that there isn't this one against many syndrome that has always ensured that China always has got an upper hand when dealing with Africa, because it's easier to deal with the one single African country. It's easier as opposed to the collective continent coming up with a collective approach that we don't have currently, and we seem, even if we come up with, not to implement to the latter. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, I've tried to run through the Sino-Kenyan relations. Thank you so much.
Thanks for Dr. Westen Shilaho's presentation. The third speaker is my dear partner, the co-director of Confucius Institute and the University of Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyae. He will be speaking on the outcomes of the FOCAC Summit for South Africa and China's relationship. South Africa is China's leading trading partner on the continent, and this year they are celebrating for 20 years formal diplomatic relationship. This is a very important relationship. We have no one better than our next speaker. He is one of the leading experts on African and South African foreign policy. He has appeared on various media platforms and also very popular in China. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. David Monyae.
Thank you. Once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My task is quite simple. I'm going to say a few things. Perhaps I should start with the main arguments, lay them out, then get into the gritties. I can see the timekeeper looking at me. How much time do I have? Oh, okay, I don't need that. I think I'll take less time. South Africa-China relation cannot be analyzed outside regional as well as global politics. And therefore, I think it is proper to lay the foundation that at this particular juncture, the world is undergoing an unprecedented shift, a shift in which the post-1945 world order is crumbling. It is dying. It's on its deathbed as we speak. The institutions that anchors global governance, such as the United Nations, WTO, World Bank, IMF, any other structure you can think of that came about in the post-1945, it's no longer holding the credibility, it's no longer holding the power, nor do they have resources, and more importantly, they don't have ideas in taking our world out of a crisis that is in. I think what worsens the situation is that the world that we're in, that we're going through, all of us, it has a huge impact on our continent, and it has a huge impact on South Africa. The continent has been unable to come out of a post-colonial. There has been much of freedom at a political level. Our people are able to vote, they're going to associate, free media. There's so much talk about democracy. But the kind of these freedoms we talk about on our continent, there's a lot of shortcomings, because in my simple world, democracy does not only reside in the ballot box. Democracy, for me, resides equally in our stomachs. Therefore, if the stomach is not full, the greatest index of measuring democracy, it's how full is your stomach. And if the stomach is not full, our people are hungry, unemployment is high, lack of infrastructure, there is nothing that we can talk about that is democratic about our continent. Therefore, in the last 15, 20 years, African head of states and governments met in Addis Ababa, as they did in 1963. In 1963, with Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and quite a number of outstanding African head of states, they were talking about freedom from the colonial, the political freedom. The past 15, 20 years, they came up with a new thinking that the political freedom need to be added with the economic freedom. And to achieve that, what will drive Africa will be the sole need for regional integration. And the heart of regional integration is the question of infrastructure development, connectivity. Our people need to trade among themselves. It's shameful if we look at the figures and the index that only 12% of our trade as Africans is among ourselves. The bulk of trade is outsiders, whether in the East or in the West. And this has to come to an end. We cannot develop as a people if our people are not highly educated. The infrastructure in education and health, the roads, the movement of goods, the movement of languages, the movement of culture across the continent. It is not moving at a pace that is required to propel our full independence as well as enjoyment of the freedom. I think, having said that, South Africa finds itself in a dilemma in which, relatively speaking, it's the highly developed on the African continent country in the region, but internally it has massive challenges which I cannot talk about. I don't have time. Whether you're moving from state capture or you're talking about unemployment, you're talking about health issues, higher education, free fees must fall, and all what you want to mention. These are some of the major challenges that the country confronts. Having attained freedom in 1994, the Constitution is one of the best. However, to actualize, to ensure that the Constitution deliver bread on the table remains a huge challenge. Foreign policy, main aim of any foreign policy, it's how your foreign policy mirrors your domestic, and to what extent can your foreign policy achieve your domestic needs. Basically, that's the challenge that South Africa confronts. As it seeks relationship with countries, South Africa strongly believes that it does not choose Western or East, neither Washington nor Beijing. It is a non-aligned, it seeks relationship to advance its own interest as well as the interests of the continent. So it is in that context that China comes into the picture. That South Africa's relationship with China has matured. It's one of the longest when you look at informal as well as formal. At informal level, if you look at the history, I share what my colleagues have already alluded to, whether from Ethiopia or Kenya, the history is littered with relationship between Chinese and Africans. And it comes up right here in South Africa and the entire region, that Chinese have been having trade with Africans way before the colonial or Europeans entering our continent. And therefore, there's absolutely nothing new. And the old noise about China, it surprises those who understand history, that there's absolutely nothing new. What is new is a sense of well-structured, mature trade, as well as a relation, which in itself has opportunities and challenges. The relationship can be divided into, for the interest of time, into 3 phases. The very first phase is the one I'm talking about. That goes up with our own colonial and apartheid era. You had a number of Chinese who were brought to South Africa as endangered laborers in the mining sector. And as you are aware, South Africa has the largest number of Chinese South Africans, more than any other African continent. However, due to apartheid and the revolution in China in 1949, the apartheid government closed the Chinese embassy as well as the Soviet Union embassy in the 50s. Those embassies were the first ones to be shut down by the apartheid for obvious reasons, that the Soviet Union and China were much more pro the liberation movements and not advancing the apartheid era. Comes the second phase of South Africa-China relation is the transition, which in itself has its own challenges, that the de Klerk government before 1994 rushed to try to reach out to China, and they were somehow going against the grain, the ANC and other liberation movements who were not keen to have China have relationship with a government before the elections of 1994. And the apartheid government was closer to Taiwan, which is a province of China. And that relationship where South Africa, the liberation movement now in government in 1994, continued with Taiwan, while its main player and strategic partner, China, was not really formally having diplomatic relationship. So 20 years ago, that changed, entering the phase that we are in, which is the third phase, where the normalization of relationship between South Africa and China has been growing quite drastically. It has reached a level of strategic partnership. These are good friends. The governing party and the Chinese have met as far back as 1955 in Bandung. And therefore, I think the issue is that South Africa and China share quite a number of strategic thinking. One, that the current world order should not remain the same. Number two, there is a need to democratize the international order. There is a need of bringing in developing countries in all other structures of global governance. I think at the political level, South Pretoria and Beijing share quite more or less same view. Even though China has not reached a point of fully supporting the transformation of United Nations Security Council, which remains a thorny issue as we speak, that there is a need for China to fully support Africa, to sit within the greatest power within the United Nations Security Council. So that remains an issue that within China, Africa, one hopes things will change. When it comes to trade, the relationship has reached, South Africa has a number of Chinese companies. The largest number of Chinese enterprises are here in South Africa. We have employed quite a number of people. So when it comes to numbers, the numbers are looking good. Equally so, there are a number of South African companies that are in China, small in number though. You have your SAP, you have SAP Miller, you have Standard Bank with 20% Chinese owned, and you have quite a number of small, medium companies getting into China. But that opportunity, I don't think it has been exploited enough. There's a great opportunity for more South African companies and African companies entering the Chinese market. I think that is needed urgently to ensure that Africa benefits from this rich relationship between China and Africa. The question, I'm not getting into my presentation deliberately because some of the similarities from the two other presenters, we share more or less similar issues with differences here and there.
However, I would like, for the benefit of this seminar, to really discuss this idea of infrastructure, particularly in relation to what my dear friend Westen has mentioned. If we go back in those who did political economy, you look at scholars such Alexander Gerschenkron. Alexander Gerschenkron argue that countries that are not developed, they need to have the state playing a critical role, entering the zones of underdevelopment and create infrastructure in a manner that private sector cannot go in those areas. You have to create that market through physical infrastructure development. And therefore, I have a total different view from yours, that what we have in Africa, it's a question of chicken and egg. What should you start? You cannot talk of the rail development that is not viable because you don't have volumes of people. Where are you going to have that? When? Should you wait 100 years? What we know is that the state need to play that catalytic role to develop a market. Ensure that the rural area have rail, have roads. Those who are growing maize, chicken, and those chicken and tomatoes need to get to the market on time. And that you need, I think you need that. Until you reach a point where the private sector, the state has to withdraw from those activities, the private sector comes in. So the bigger question I have, even for you, is that who is going to develop those infrastructure if the state does not? Are you waiting for the private sector to do that? So, I mean, the Western world argues that you need the private sector. You have to have enough volumes of people and trucks and for you to develop a road. And therefore, that's the reason why IMF and World Bank has not been funding the Kenyan government on those infrastructure. Those are not viable. Since 1980, that has been a crisis. China presented a different strategy, which is the same as in Ethiopia, that you have to develop infrastructure, core, to ensure that you have activities on the ground, economic activities, and those activities need to grow to a level that development starts kicking in, because you can't parachute that in a underdeveloped. So there's a huge debate that I think you and I and the rest of us need to seriously think about it before we fall into these easy arguments. The Westerns are bad or they're good, the Chinese are good or they're bad. It's neither Westerners nor the Chinese who are going to liberate Africans. Africans are going to liberate themselves through thinking and ensure that they develop infrastructure. The only core question is that where are these infrastructure going? Is it assisting to integrate our people, to ensure that there's more trade between Africans so that we increase the number that I've mentioned, that is only 12% of our own as Africans. Are we improving that? That should be our yardstick. Let us avoid the Western-driven argument that emanates from London or emanates from New York in terms of whether the China-Africa relation is beneficial to Africans or not, and let us have our own measurements. And in my own argument is that the greatest measurement whether our relationship with China is successful or not is to look at what we have defined as our driving vision for our own continent, which is the African Union Agenda 2063. That is the basis that we look at our relationship with China, and even for South Africa, to say, is China assisting Africa integrate in our relationship? Our relationship in China, is it benefiting us to lift our people from poverty? How many people in this rail, the argument that I wanted from my friend because of time, but I guess in his answer and question he could also look at. How many people are being uplifted along the rail that is developed by the Chinese? I think that is much more important and fundamental question to pose. Yes, I fully agree that the question of governance is critical. Corruption needs to be dealt with by Africans. Labor laws, regulatory framework within our countries as well as on the continent, and ensure that we punish companies that are doing bad business on the continent, corrupting our people. We are tough to whether Chinese companies or Western companies. We're talking about KPMG, McKinsey. We're talking a number of Western, I haven't heard a number of people talking about these companies that are in the forefront corrupting our people and our politicians. To what extent can we hold them accountable? That is the bigger question. So the bad business should not just be looked as East, including West. In conclusion, I see the minutes it's less. With all the noise about China, let's also be evidence-based in our critique. China's overall loans in the world, as far as Africa is concerned, constitute only 2%. It's a small figure compared to loans that we get from the Western world. The greatest debt that Africa has is not with China, it's with Western countries. So as we shed the light on China, let us not forget and switch the light on Western world. We need to be critical and ensure that exactly when we talk about debt trap, is it East or West, and coming in what format? And if we talk about debt forgiveness, where should it come from? In my view, both West, East need to look into some of these poor countries and cut off debt forgiveness. Even though it's called debt forgiveness, if you look at it, some of these countries have paid these loans way back. But the manner in which they were structured makes our countries continuously pay debt. Debt that DRC is paying, borrowed by Mobutu Sese Seko, and is continuing impoverishing DRC. And we also need to look into those issues. So in conclusion, few pointers that I would like to look at is that we need to take advantage of relationships that we're having. And we don't need to look at one direction. Because imagine in your life, you're looking only east, you are going to have problems. If for us to be successful, we need to look at east, west, all directions, guided by a clear vision. What is it that we need from all these people we are entering into relationships with? We need to ensure that our people, we invest more in our people, particularly the young, the youth. Bulk of Africa is young, less than 35 years. Africa is the future, and therefore African head of states, governments, and our own people need to invest in youth and take advantage that we send our students to Western capitals. We send them to China, we send them to Japan, we send them everywhere. Let them learn in all those capitals and come back and develop this continent. I think that's what we need to do. Infrastructure, we need to continue asking hard questions. To what extent are we going to utilize our ocean economy? In South Africa, I think during President Zuma, he talked a lot about the ocean economy. It's still in the shelves. We need to then say, what are we learning from the Chinese in terms of utilizing the ocean? Much of Africa's coast deep waters is being exploited by powers outside of Africa. They're fishing in our deep waters, and we don't have defensive mechanism of protecting our ocean. And we need to unite as a continent to ensure that we utilize our ocean for the benefit of our people. We need to ensure that the relationship we have with China, as much as with others, assist us in stabilizing, having the logistics in dealing with peacekeeping, in dealing with stabilizing the question of conflict. Because with conflicts, we're not going to develop. So those are some of the key elements that we need to look and measure at whether we are succeeding in our relationship with China or not. If we fail to do that and get excited with news from The Economist and all other and get excited, we're getting into debates that we had during the Cold War. The Cold War had more damage on the continent than other continents because it was fought on our soil. So the upcoming economic Cold War that is being started in Washington, if we are not careful as Africans, will end up being the losers. We need to refuse to enter into battles that are not ours. To refuse to enter not on the side of Chinese, not on the side of Americans. We need to strengthen our own systems, our laws, our regulatory framework. We need to learn from China. China, as we speak, has a policy that is called catching tigers and flies. It's a simply anti-corruption policy that ministers, mayors, it doesn't matter who you are, whatever position you are. If you steal people's money, they lock you up. And I don't think we're doing enough of that, of locking up our own politicians if they leave the national agenda, if they leave the continental agenda and take advantage of the relationship with China to benefit themselves. And equally so, when you talk about flies, it means even a traffic cop who's asking for a drink needs also to be equally locked up and be tough on corruption and ensure that all what we do is for the benefit of our people. I think I'll stop here and hand over to the chair. I thank you.
Thanks for Dr. David Monyae's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to the portion of the seminar where you, our attendees, reflect on what you have heard and get to ask any questions you may have. We will take 4 questions. Do not worry. A second question and answer session will follow in the second session. Of course, you can make any comment as you want. Please state your name, your organization, and ask your question or statement as briefly reflected as possible. Thank you.
Chairperson, my name is Kay. I'm from an organization called the Bit Club Network. We are in the cryptocurrency space. My question, I'll start with you, Madam Professor. Maybe this question with Dr. Monyae. This is about the initiative which was taken by the Chinese government called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. I was expecting to hear it from Dr. Monyae here, but maybe due to time constraint, please maybe share it with us so that at least we learn, because it sounds like a very interesting initiative. And then, Madam Prof, maybe tell us, we hear that the Chinese government, especially the Chinese Communist Party, has embarked, has said to its members, they must go all over China and teach the provinces there in China about blockchain. Can you share with us exactly what is the aim behind that? What can we learn from that about the blockchain? Because it sounds like it's a big space. And then, Professor, yes, Mulutega, that's right. Maybe, can you share with us what has been the benefits between Ethiopia and Eritrea? Because for some years, there was no good relationship between your country and Eritrea. But all of a sudden now, we hear that no, you have good understanding, the border has been open there. We would like to hear more about that. And then, okay, sorry, Dr. Westen. I would like to differ a little bit with your presentation. You said the relationship between China and Africa is a win-win. Yeah, yes, maybe, but I would like to differ in this way, that the Chinese, yes, as much as we welcome them here, they are helping us. They also helped us, especially when we were going rough times. But when it comes to loans, they are ruthless. If you take their money, if you don't pay, recently we heard that with some other organization in your country, in Kenya there, which failed to repay Chinese loans, and they had their assets attached by the Chinese. So I disagree with you when you say it's a win-win situation. Yes, the Chinese are here to help us, but at the same time, they mean business. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Kumbulani Kunene. I'm a second-year student here at UJ, Economics and Econometrics. First, thank you to the UJ Confucius Institute for this opportunity. One of my questions was answered about the loan, and now I've got a better perspective and understanding of the loans in which we receive from China. My main question is, how do we ordinary citizens in South Africa hold our government accountable? Having to wait for 5 years before we can hold our government accountable isn't really good enough for us. And my second question is, I'm sorry, my second question is, Gaddafi, before he passed away, he had a plan, and part of his plan was having a single currency in Africa. Movements barriers in Africa being, what is China's take if Africa were to ever implement such strategies, especially since earlier this year discussions amongst these African leaders had begun. I just want to know what is China's take to that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Chalimba from Wits Business School. To Professor Messay here, I become very skeptical when I hear someone splitting infinitives, such as China has massively contributed, China has massively created jobs. When you speak about 500 jobs without telling us the population of Ethiopia and the unemployment rate, so that we can decide ourselves that there is this massive contribution or massive employment that you are speaking about, and you speak about Ethiopia rising, the question would be for who? The question would be for who, in a sense that I'm one person who believes in societal welfare. The question is for who? Do we see opportunities for young people and for women in Ethiopia, the state of education, healthcare? Because at the end of the day, we've realized that even if there is this rising, it's not evenly distributed. And indeed, it has never trickled down. So I would like to check with you, this rising for who? Thank you.
Good afternoon, if it's afternoon yet. My name's Charles Collicott. I'm from the Helen Suzman Foundation, economic researcher there. I would like to know from either of the panelists, with regards to the Chinese loan that South Africa's taken on recently. Sorry, last one. Why was that not channeled through, say, for example, the BRICS Bank? We've gone to all the trouble of setting this up, but why not the BRICS Bank, for example? Why is it shrouded in so much secrecy would be the next, well, I don't know if we can answer, but what's the rationale behind not doing it through such a structure? Thank you.
Greetings to the sitting. My name is Tato, a student right here at the University of Johannesburg. Mine, it is very simple. At the current summit that happened this year, the FOCAC summit, there is a number of things that were discussed, economic and social. We are looking at what was disseminated by the different various presidents. In looking at the budget, a prepared stratified list of specific segments objected to reach and overcome objectives, e.g. difficulties in connecting to the limited design infrastructure development, inadequate availability and accessibility of accurate data, and perceived low return on investment. The specific stratus objective of the FOCAC shall clearly reflect and identify the needs of the targeted groups and financial beneficiaries, which last year we witnessed the Development Bank of BRICS being opened by the former president of South Africa, which the reality of it was measurable. In the case that of South Africa, it is not realistic for the majority living in extreme indigence and indulgence, because when we look at the process that China overtook to elevate more than 100 million people out of poverty in South Africa, we look at the margin where 27% of the 56 million of South Africa, still now it is increasing even further. So there is a mechanism that is not sufficient in effectively supporting and bridging the gap between the two stratas of a lower and upper stratas in South Africa, which with the regards of the implementation and the investment project of the economic and financial analysis must show the technology alternative chosen by showing economic and financial net present value that should benefit the segmented groups or the beneficiaries on the socio-economic and the environmental level. So with that being said, it shall be indicated that the most promising, cost-effective, feasible strategy alternative are selected to achieve the overall objective, with the destitution of elevating through economic development with or without commercial security zenith. The scenario has been analyzed on a feasibility studies on a different technology and location options. So with that, we want to know that in bridging the gap between the fourth industrial revolution and then elevating our South African cities and reducing the margin of unemployment rate, which we see that the infrastructure is not feasible enough to meet the development. We want to know how is it going to be available and achievable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think to address the economic development question that my previous colleague and comrade raised right now is, it's really up to us as Africa to determine if the relationship between China or any other bilateral country really, China, the US, the EU, is a beneficial one towards ourselves. Because it doesn't make sense that the previous lecturer said there that a lot of relations between China and Kenya are resulting in a current deficit where there's not a lot of benefits from China, where we're not even exporting any of our resources from China to, Kenya to China. And another factor that I think we need to consider, especially in conversation with this China and Africa relations, is we need to see ourselves as Africans as a country in its own. Because a lot of countries, especially those who report about 2 months back, where CNN released a report that the First Lady of the USA will be visiting Africa in December. And a lot of countries across the world accepted the sentiments, but African countries themselves were even questioning, yeah, but where in Africa? Where in Africa? We do not consider ourselves as a supreme country or a powerhouse of our own. We still have that conceptual note that we are dividends of various colonial states, and we need to take it as an advantage, especially with continental agreements such as the Continental Free Trade Agreement that was passed in March, where we can now trade across the entire African continent and open up businesses with minimal to no taxations at all. And also the clearing of visas amongst African countries, so I can travel to any African country with a passport alone without needing a visa. This is opening up to that mentality that we need to consider ourselves as a country and a continent alone. So our economics is in that aspect as well. So it's up to us to determine if it's really beneficial or not.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucky. I'm a student at UJ. The first thing I would like to indicate is that I think our African leaders, or I can say our African countries, are weak when it comes to the relationship with China. Because if you look, I don't know whether we are just talking here or we have ever been on the ground where those plants are operating. If you check number one, they don't add value in local companies. We are talking about transfer of technology and everything, but when you go to those plants, when the Chinese are to build a road or something, they will bring their equipment. A truck will be written Chinese. It's a type of truck we have never seen in Africa. They will bring their own equipment here. So they are not adding value in the local stuff. But another thing, what is good about China, I think they are doing better as compared to our former colonies. Because if you check, at least you relate with China, you have a road, you have been in a relationship with Brazil, Portugal, and Mozambique. Those countries, they've never had the Bay Bridge that was built lately by the Chinese. So those are the good things that China is doing. But then my question is to Dr. Monyae, the issue of 12%. Don't you think that there's a resistance within Africans to make trade? It seems as if when someone comes from Europe to do business in Africa, it's easier for us to accept that and believe that this is a good business. But then when is a fellow African from Ethiopia or wherever coming to South Africa to start a business, we tend to undermine that. I don't know, I just don't need your clarification on that. And then my second one goes to Prof. Mulutega. The quality of product. What is it that you think that makes the European country, makes China to deliver quality products in Europe and fails to deliver quality products in Africa, as you have said? I just want to clarity on that. And then the last one is to Dr. Shilaho. You spoke much about the government and the president. I don't know, what kind of government do you think should be in Kenya rather than that of Uhuru Kenyatta, that you think will make these bilateral relations work? Thank you.
My name is Jaconia Timba, and I'm an individual entrepreneur. Owing to the statement that was issued by Dr. Shilaho on the personal interest of the politicians in major projects that are bringing in setbacks, who talks to the investors? Is it private sector or the state? And who issues the guarantees against investments? And what are the policies of the investors towards corruption in each and every country? And who distributes those projects to the entrepreneurs in that particular country? Thank you.
Thanks for all of you to the comment, presentation, and the questions. Now let's invite our professor from left to right. Okay, and perhaps some of your questions will be combined to answer together. So first, invite Professor Tara. Okay.
Thank you very much for the questions. This showed that how much we are really concerned about development, change, and the like. In fact, one of the questions to me was the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Yes, indeed. For the last 20 years, the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea was bad. But the issue is not the conflict between the two people of Ethiopia and people of Eritrea, not. It was personal problem between the president of Eritrea and the prime minister of Eritrea and Ethiopia, we guess. The conflict between two personalities, two persons. I have to say, unfortunately, our prime minister died some 5 years back. Then another prime minister came in for some 4 or 5 years. Then he was also deposed by public uprising. Then now the incumbent or the president in the office is another one, the third one. He is very transformative, very peace-loving, development-loving too. Then he tried to solve the problems that we had with Eritrea and other neighboring countries too. So at present it is okay, and the relationship between two governments and two people is now solved. So the basic reason was not the problem between the people at large, it means. The second question to me was about massive employment. Yes, I said many times, and I also would like to say it then and now. Because the employment opportunity created by a single country project in Ethiopia is about 500,000, 500,000. So what can I say? What alternative words do I have for this 500,000 employment opportunity created by a single country in Ethiopia over only within the last 10 years? Yes, no doubt, it is massive job opportunity. Job opportunity for whom? For the professionals and for daily laborers too. For engineers, PhD holders, accountants, and many daily laborers. It is really massive. I would like to appreciate that one. And in fact, the third question related to Ethiopia is rising. Yes, indeed, Ethiopia is economically rising. This, I have shown you many indicators in picture as well as in numerical values. But the issue is, it is not fairly distributed, particularly up until April 2018, up until the coming to power of the current Prime Minister in Ethiopia. The government that we had, unfortunately, over the last 27 years, was very corrupted government. Ministers are now billionaires. They have $5, $4, or $3 billion in banks in Europe, in the United States of America. We know that. Corrupted. Because of this grand level of corruption, the development that we have in Ethiopia was not fairly distributed. There are extremely poor people in Ethiopia. Interestingly enough, about 20% of the people in Ethiopia are food insecure. Food insecure. About 8 billion are under productive safety net program in Ethiopia. Okay? About 20 million. But there are, again, still there are extremely rich people whose breakfast is in London, lunch may be in Beijing, dinner may be in Washington, D.C., enjoying life. Two people, two scenarios. Okay? This is the issue that we have. It is not fair. But the government is now trying its best level. The government, other stakeholders, the scholars even, we are trying our best level to bring the development to the level it could be fair and evenly distributed in the near future. And finally, one of the discussants raised the issue of quality product in Europe and in Africa. Yes, indeed. I was in Gwangju area. I asked the entrepreneurs there, I asked them why you send poor quality to Ethiopia, to Africa and so on. Why you do the high quality items to Europe, to America and the like. Their response was the same and similar. They said, your purchasing power is very low. Purchasing power is very low. You can't buy good quality items, good quality laptop, good quality shoes, good quality jacket and the like because of the purchasing power. But I wish Africa is rising, Ethiopia is rising, will be to the level that we can buy durable and good quality items being exported from China and other parts of the country. And finally, I would like to say, I don't like word like we are weak, we are things like that. Africa is strong. We have to change that that word. I think yes. I know that because of the problems, because of the conflicts, because of the environment and the like, we are behind the world. But we are not weak. We are very strong people, north to west, south to north. We are strong people, and we have to have that mentality, it means. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's invite Westen, Shilaho, do some feedback and answers.
Thanks so much for your questions. Prof and I read from the same hymn book. I do not subscribe to the notion that Africa has to be hobbled by this dichotomy between China and the West. That's moot. At the same time, for instance, you hear people ask, what is Trump's African policy? What if it's not in his best interest to have one? The question is, what is Africa's strategic approach towards the US, towards Trump? It's not for us to sit back and wait for him to come up with a framework and then we say, okay, where can I fit in? So it's neither here nor there. So my position is about your interests. If you are a president of Burundi, Kenya, South Africa, if you are to enter some bilateral or multilateral negotiations, oblivious of what is in the best interest of your people, then perennially your people come short. I don't think you're doing yourself any justice. Which why I said earlier that if the Chinese appreciate what is in the best interest of their people, the Chinese Communist Party, this one party that when they came into power, they had this strategic vision to do so much for their people, and they have succeeded in doing that. And that's what we have to borrow from them. And I don't think we're doing that yet. So, Prof, we're speaking the same language, but when it comes to Kenya, Prof, the question cynics are asking is this: why would the government pump so much money into standard relay gauge against the backdrop of a dilapidated health infrastructure, against a backdrop of so many children of school-going age who may not be in school, against the backdrop of road infrastructure that is used by so many Kenyans, which is neglected. It's a question of priorities. Against the backdrop of lack of energy. So what is of strategic importance to the people in the immediacy sense of the word? So to say we need roads, or we need the railway line, or we need education, or do we need health, I don't think we'll talk about that, because that would be a false choice. I do concur with you. It would be a false choice. We need all these things. But when a government disregards the immediate needs of its people, then there's something fundamentally wrong with that. That is the bone of contention. That, I think, is the gist of what I said. Secondly, for instance, Prof, the SGR is said to be, it has cost so much compared to the Prof's one, the one from Ethiopia, the Addis Ababa Djibouti one. Yet that one is longer and it is electrified. This one is diesel. You know, in fact, when it was being launched, one of the Chinese officials present cracked a joke. The locomotives that were being launched, he saw them last when he was a young boy in his village. And that was telling how out of date that kind of technology is. But nonetheless, it's quite consumed so much. Win-win. Perhaps if you didn't get me, I said that is how it's framed. The relationship between Africa and China is always looked at favorably in comparison to the relationship between Africa and its traditional trading partners, and specifically its former colonial masters. And that's why it's for the mutual benefit of both parties. China, Africa, it's a win-win. China doesn't ask moral questions about the rule of law, democracy, good governance, whatever that is. Like, we don't interfere with the internal affairs as Africans, unlike the West, who ask those ideological questions. But I say it's not that clear-cut. It's not that clear-cut. And I mentioned the aspect they bring out. We've been indebted to the West. We know how debilitating that kind of thing is. So we can't say we were indebted to the West, so there's nothing fundamentally wrong with us being indebted to the Chinese. I don't think that would be the position to take, and having taken that position. For me, it's not a question of who has helped Africa more. It's a question of how is Africa strategic in terms of engaging with external partners. It's a question of when will Africa wean itself off this dependency kind of syndrome? We do our own thing. It's not a question, okay, you're saying we're giving so much to the Chinese, but we gave so much to the Brits, we gave so much to the Americans, we gave so much to the French. I don't think that's kind of an argument we can make. It's not sustainable. So, and I pointed out the continuities in this Africa-China relationship, and taking Kenya as a case study, that holding the wrong end of the stick perpetually, regardless of who you're engaging with, wouldn't be in the best interest of anyone. And that's why, for instance, recently, this was yesterday when I read about the new regime in Sierra Leone has decided to cancel some Chinese loan that had been signed by the previous president to construct a new airport closer to the city, as opposed to the current one, which is far away. You have to use a boat to get into the city. So the new president canceled that and said it wasn't viable. There were other pressing issues for the Sierra Leoneans. I am not yet aware of whose assets were attached in Kenya. I have to find out. But I've heard about some assets being attached in Sri Lanka, or some talk about assets. Perhaps the colleague from Zambia will shed light on that. The fears that some assets will be attached in Zambia if the country fails to meet its debt obligations. So, Prof, in a nutshell, Kenya's debt is like 52.6% of its GDP, which is problematic. It means there isn't much money for development. So people are asking, we can't work, pay taxes, only to repay debts. That's not in the best interest of the country. That will also stymie the country's vision 2030 to become a middle-income country. That will also put a damper to the collective Africa's Agenda 2063. Gaddafi, you mentioned there's some moments something about Gaddafi and its vision of United States of Africa. Something. I think that was quixotic. Gaddafi had a knack for quixotic ideas. And I think none other than Thabo Mbeki had issues with this kind of approach. Because Gaddafi wanted that thing here and now, and he wanted to be president of Africa. Can't we stagger it? Let's stagger it and see how it pans out. So, yeah, he had great ideas, but Gaddafi, one thing we don't appreciate is that he didn't have much room within the Arab League. He was fond of brown envelope diplomacy, and he really found great room within the AU. Lots of guys he could easily influence through largesse from the oil proceeds. And so he could come up with all sorts of ideas, some of which were fantastic, which couldn't be implemented. So we have to appreciate that even as we celebrate him and we try to canonize him. And he was a dictator to boot. So that kind of thing can't come to fruition within the African context because the colonial borders are sacrosanct in Africa. Of course, we have had some deviations from that with the coming into being of South Sudan in 2011. And as to whether that idea was in the best interest of Africa, is still debatable. But OAU, during its formation, one of the topmost items on the agenda was to affirm the colonial borders. And that's what has made it impossible, for instance, for the AU, despite all the talk about renewal, despite all the talk about revamping the OAU into AU, it hasn't evolved into a supranational entity that could make decisions and the decision that could be binding to member states. So we're still grappling with that. Trump's wife has already been to Africa. He's not coming in December. Some colleagues, it's been there. Kenya, Malawi, Egypt, and Ghana. Kenya about Uhuru Kenyatta. That's the conundrum Kenyans have to contend with. About leadership. What do they do? Because when you have a head of state who at the same time makes decisions that impact on how the economy is managed, who at the same time is the wealthiest person in the land, that's problematic. But in Kenya, particularly within the political circles, conflict of interest is unfortunately absent in their lexicon. So you can juggle these things. Today, you're making decisions that affect every other person, but you are the first person to benefit from those decisions owing to the immense business interests that you have. So then we have the conundrum. Is it a question of fish rotting from the head? Or is it a question of scum to the top? Because we have to grapple with leaders who are detached from the interests of the people on the continent. And so we found that if Prof talked about the Chinese being extremely impatient with corruption and that kind of behavior, because they know how, like rust, it corrodes the state machinery and whatever vision you come up with. But if we have leaders who are equally corrupt and they hollow out all the oversight institutions such as the judiciary, independent oversight institutions, civil society, and what have you, so that leaders have carte blanche to do what they wish, even subvert democracy, because they can corrupt the electoral body. And when you go to court, you find pliable justices whose verdict is well known and will be in favor of the incumbent. What do you do? Now, the other question is it a question of leaders portraying malaise that is prevalent within the wider society, so that regardless of how many elections you have, you get the same people, corrupt, promise heaven and earth, but end up being corrupt? So how do you cleanse such a society? That is the conundrum. I don't think I've got easy answers to that kind of a question, but we have to continue, because democracy calls for eternal vigilance. And we don't have to give up until we get it right. Yeah, I think that those are the challenges and those are the questions I think I was asked. Unless there's a question I've forgotten, but that's all about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Shilaho. Let's invite Dr. Monyae David.
Thank you, Chair. Please don't wait for us. You can eat while we're talking. Go ahead, please. I think I was asked a few questions. One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road is a massive initiative called in, I think it started in 2015 by President Xi to build infrastructure, alternative infrastructure. When you look at IMF, World Bank, there is an infrastructure gap that runs into trillions, if in Asia, in Africa, in a number of developing countries. And the thinking around One Belt, One Road is that China wants to work with more than 60 countries to develop this infrastructure, roads, rail, and the sea. And as you are aware, at this moment, China appears to have much more cash, hard cash, and compared to developed countries. Since 2008, hard cash is drying in the Westen, and China seems to have more. And therefore, I think that thinking itself was coupled with quite a number of other initiatives. Firstly, the establishment of the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as the BRICS Bank, NDB. So these are global South institutions, a new institution from your traditional institutions. However, there has been, it's not clear-cut that the global South countries, China is working with developed countries in a number of key areas, including within the AIB itself, the investments, Britain, quite a number of countries, Canada are members of the AIB. How does AIB fit in within the bigger picture of Africa? Africa lacks infrastructure, and Africa has its own roadmap. The AU came up with the Agenda 2063, that in 2063, when Africa celebrates its 100 years of existence, it wants a situation in which we have well-oiled infrastructure, our people are at peace with ourselves and peace with the world. You Google up the Agenda 2063. It gives a very clear-cut view of what Africa wants to see happening. And in that thinking, within the AU itself, there's the North-South corridor, that from Durban, from Cape Town to Cairo, we need to have infrastructure, rail, roads, so that we don't have to go to France to come back to the continent to reach Morocco. We have to go straight to Morocco and cut out the middle people along the way. So it's a vision that is on the African continent, not yet achieved, and therefore initiatives in Kenya and Ethiopia, as small as they are, they do indeed speak to the bigger picture of what Africa wants to see happening as defined by the Agenda 2063. And our argument, we are quite clear. One would want to argue that we cannot enter into any of these programs without our own agenda. What is it that we want in One Belt, One Road? One Belt, One Road will be great for Africa only if Africa, when it comes to value chain in terms of the goods that we produce, finished goods, that we need to stop sending raw material as we used to do. We need to start to beneficiate our raw material in our own countries and ensure that we take advantage of One Belt, One Road. We need to also supply material, not just for China, but for the world, using One Belt, One Road within the bigger value chain. Finished goods, therefore, stop sending coffee from Tanzania, Ethiopia, which is a common thing. This is Tanzanian coffee. It ships to London, it comes back as British coffee. We buy that and we get excited when we are drinking coffee in Sandton, that we are excited drinking coffee from Britain. It's not British coffee, it's African coffee. We have to roast the beans here, and we want our Chinese friends to help us, not to buy our raw material, but to ensure that we beneficiate, we add value to our raw material, so that we create more employment, we ensure that we trade among ourselves, not just to supply China, but go beyond China. Former Soviet Union using the very same belt, because the One Belt, One Road is not targeted only for Africa. It is for former Soviet bloc, Russia, United States, Latin America. So we want to use the old belts. There are old belts, colonial belts, and we continue using, we're still using those belts that go to London and Washington, but we also want to build new belts that go to Global South, that reach easily Beijing, Moscow, and Japan, so that we can expand our goods, and we can expand within this very same belt. We need to ask key and critical question. What travels in this belt? Not just goods, people. As people travel, the civilization mix. We don't want one civilization coming one direction to the continent. We want a multiplicity of civilizations, that we, our own African civilization, reaches a level that interacts with the Chinese, Asian, European, and other civilization in a manner that we all are equal. I think that's the main aim that Africa strives to achieve. And if we can achieve that, then we can say we are being successful in our approach, in our relationship with China or any other member. The benefit, we can't throw more money, our resources used without us benefiting. The other question, I think, has to, I can't remember. Accountability is a key issue. And I share the views from the public as well as my colleagues. We cannot at any moment blame our friends for the ills that are generated domestically. We have to clean our house. We have to ensure that we doom the house for any problem, particularly corruption. Corruption is a big issue on the African continent. In Kenya, in Ethiopia, here we're talking about state capture here in South Africa. It's an Africa crisis. And if we can stop everything else and look at this crisis and say, we as Africans will hold our people accountable. And it's only us, we can do that. And we cannot add, when we talk about China and talk about corruption, I mean, why do you blame someone who's bringing stuff? You blame your own people. You have power to hold your people accountable. So it's the people, I think people's power. That's why in our constitution and even the continental documents opens by saying we the people, and we need to insist on we part than corrupt politicians that move around and speak on our behalf while money is flowing into their pockets. I think it doesn't matter whether they're in Tanzania or they're here in Pretoria, they need to be locked up. I think that's the core message, directly answering your question. My brother right there asked a question about BRICS. The question of secrecy of deals, I mean, I'll be interested to take the arguments even further with you. Your institute does quite a lot of good work. I would like to hear where the contracts, deals that are signed, are put on the internet and transparent. My understanding of deals, that most deals, whether it's the East, West, most of all these deals are secret. My point here is that let us not use a different yardstick, norms and value when we hold the Chinese accountable. We need to do the same with our Western stakeholders. All deals need to be open and transparent. I think that's the issue. And it's all up to us to demand that. And let us not use double standards. We judge others differently. We've had lots of deals that has been going. Most of them went wrong with Western powers. Let's talk about that as well as the new deals that we are signing. But we cannot ask Americans, whether in Goa, dumping rotten chicken on our markets, or we have to hold them accountable within their Goa and understand that. So I think we need to do the same with the Chinese, yes. We have to ensure that these deals are favorable to us. I think the main argument that we are arguing is that there's a golden opportunity for us that on the marketplace, we now have an opportunity than any other time in the history of the continent. We're no longer relying on loans from Western countries. They remain the most powerful, they remain the core and hegemonic power. However, a rising China, rising Asia, and Japan and others are also coming in the pipeline. We now have an alternative that gives us that leverage to argue for better terms of the loans. So if the Americans can't take a deal, we say we're going to the British. If the British terms are terrible, we then tell them we are talking to the Japanese, and the Japanese, we go to the Chinese. So we have to take the best terms, not the people, the best terms for us. In terms of how long is this loan, what's the interest of this loan, those are core questions that we need to ask than us getting bogged down into China and all the current arguments that are going out there. It's not evidence-based. It's not very clear. It does not originate in our capitals. It's being imposed by others as they compete with China. So I think our view is that we need to be clear. We need to ask Chinese good questions as we should ask Westerners good questions that benefit our people. Chair, I think I'll end here.
Thanks for Dr. Monyae David's answer.